Welcome and thank you for joining us for the first episode in our new Fearless Minds research series, Cause for Alarm: Violence Against Women with Disability. I'm Patrick Major from Flinders University's Fearless Minds team, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion as we explore the journey of women with disability experiencing violence. To begin with, I'd like to acknowledge that we're hosting this discussion on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and that we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We also acknowledge and convey our deep appreciation to the elders of all the nations upon which Flinders operates. This event is delivered as part of our Fearless Minds series. Over the course of the series, you'll meet some of Flinders University's most engaging early to mid-career researchers as they bring you their latest research from a diverse range of fields. Today, we're fortunate to be hearing from Dr. Amy Marshall, who is a postdoctoral research fellow here at Flinders University. Amy is a member of the Flinders Caring Futures Institute, Australia's first fully dedicated research centre for the study of self-care and caring solutions. Amy is also undertaking research into aged care with our brand new Aged Care Centre for Growth and Translational Research. Amy, you must be extremely busy. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, Amy, we'd like to talk about your research into the journey of women with disability who experience family violence. Now, it's estimated that women with disability experience partner violence at higher rates than the wider population of women. Why do you think this is?
So they do experience violence at higher rates than their non-disabled peers. Women with disability experience physical violence at roughly 1.5 times the rate, and sexual violence at twice the rate of non-disabled women. So these are very alarming statistics. The Disability Royal Commission has indeed called them very much alarming. This is not a small problem. 1 in 5 Australians report living with disability. So it is quite a significant issue for Australia to grapple with. The cause of much of this violence really comes down to quite a lot of intersecting things. There's a very large body of growing literature which tells us or gives us some really good insights into why women with disability experience higher rates of violence. And much of that has to do with violence being targeted towards their disability. This can look like things like physical sexual violence that specifically focuses on the disability that the woman experiences. It can be withholding care, it can be withdrawal of medication or aids, it can be forced or coerced sterilisation, all sorts of disability-specific forms of violence on top of the forms of violence that many people experience in their relationships. A complicating factor for many women is that the violence is perpetrated by the same person that is their carer. So this often results in women staying in relationships longer than they would ordinarily choose to because they're dependent on this person economically, socially, physically. Women with disability can sometimes be less likely to be able to identify or describe what they're experiencing as violence. And when they do, they're less likely to be believed or to be seen as a reliable witness. Underpinning all of that, it's really important to say that disability is not a causative risk factor in itself. It doesn't cause violence. It is exploited by abusers.
So, Amy, you've been involved with a project called Connecting the Dots as part of the Flinders Disability and Community Inclusion Unit. Can you tell us a bit more about that research?
I can. Connecting the Dots was funded by ANROSE, which is the Australian National Research Organisation for Women's Safety. And we looked at the needs and experiences of children and young people with disability when they experience family and domestic violence and how services and supports meet their needs. What's the word I'm looking for? Up until quite recently, basically, research in this area has tended to view children as extra on top of the women and not seeing them as necessarily people in their own right with agency and ideas and opinions. So what we tried to do with that was to lift their voices. We used a range of methods. We looked at large databases, we looked at child protection cases, and we spoke very in depth with children and young people with disability and the people who support them. And we found that they are highly overrepresented in the systems that they engage with at times of violence and afterwards. And Aboriginal and rural and remote children with disability even more so. We found that there were very few opportunities for children to have their say. We did find some examples of good practice where children were involved ethically and positively, but it was very ad hoc. So there's no systemic approach to ensure that children get to have their say.
So what do we know about how the healthcare and disability systems deal with violence against women and children with disability? Can you describe the intersection between those two systems?
Sure. So again, previous research gives us some great insights into how those two sectors deal with violence against women and children. And the short answer is not brilliantly. But again, there are examples of really good practice. So in the disability sector, for instance, there are significant constraints, particularly around funding. So the NDIS doesn't fund anything that is not disability specific. So if trauma is part of the picture, they won't fund a service that will work with that child's trauma, for example. In the health sector, there is very little resourcing available, just like in the disability sector. And that's compounded by further pressures around time and throughput and so on. So there is no educational training, for example, for most of our healthcare professionals in how to identify and respond to violence. That's despite the fact that it represents the biggest burden of disease in Australia for women under the age of 50. That's higher than cancer or heart disease. And the next project that we're going to do, which is funded by the Flinders Foundation, will be exploring the journey of women with disability through the healthcare system. So it's really important that we hear their version of events, essentially. So those two systems are then doubly impacted by the chronic underfunding of the domestic and family violence sector. They intersect because people with disability experiencing domestic and family violence often require more support. They're dealing with disability life already and kind of health issues that often accompany that, support needs that accompany that. They're also dealing with marginalisation and lack of access. And at times of crisis, they need, or often, not always, I don't want to be presumptive, sorry, they often need extra supports. Those supports are highly siloed. We have our health system, we have our police system, we have our court system, we have disability, we have education. All of those systems are very separate, but people aren't siloed. They need all of those services at the same time.
So Amy, you're extremely passionate about this topic. Why is this research so important to you? And what do you think we need to do to tackle this problem? It strikes me as though often the people themselves aren't being involved in this research. They need to be more sort of central to the aim of it. How do you feel about that?
I would completely agree with you. I'm passionate about this research. Initially, it started as a personal journey, and over time that has grown to see the change in our kind of social conversation around how we understand violence against women and children, and that there are now actually better understandings of how other forms of marginalisation intersect with that violence. And those are things around disability and rural and remote living, Indigenous status, age, socioeconomic background, cultural background. So we're starting to slowly, I've got to say it is slow, but it is happening, have a more sophisticated understanding. And it's great to see that shift happening. And I think that needs to happen more apace and have more diverse voices. In terms of addressing the causes, it's kind of a little bit like how long is a piece of string in many ways. We need to be doing more to address inequality and marginalisation. We need to be identifying and working with perpetrators far earlier than we are. and we need to be responding to the needs of victim survivors more fully in a very systematic way, not in an ad hoc way. The root cause really at all of this is inequality, and until we address that inequality, which, as I said, is often exploited by people who abuse, then we're really only going to be able to get so far.
I'd love to touch on your research journey here at Flinders now, Amy. Can you tell me about how you found yourself in this field?
Mine's a little bit of a potted history, actually. I didn't have a very linear journey into where I am now. Like so many people, I didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up. So I did a Bachelor of Arts and tried a few different things. And I loved sociology and how that gave me a deeper understanding of our social world. And that, in a way, naturally led to research for me, because you get to talk to real people about real issues and identify real answers. And so I did my honours, and then I went away and I worked in various industries and sectors, and then I came back and did my master's, and then I went away and worked in various sectors and industries, and then I did my PhD because I just had to keep coming back and digging a little bit further. So research for me was a little bit of like scratching an itch. Research for me is very much about knowledge, and knowledge is power. And when we know more, we can develop ways to address problems that are evidence-based and informed by lived experience rather than assumptions or beliefs or politics.
So, Amy, what would be your advice to anyone considering a research path similar to yours, ideally here at Flinders? Would you have any advice for future PhD students?
Yeah, anybody considering going into health or disability, I would strongly recommend it. It would be valuable, impactful research, and I would strongly encourage that. And the more diverse voices, the better. Advice to PhD students would probably start with things like being organised. People would recommend to me a lot to keep a diary and that kind of thing, which I didn't, so I'm a hypocrite. But those things are actually, in hindsight, really, really useful. Another one would be to make sure that you're doing research that is important to you, because you've got to keep that fire in your belly to get through the tough parts. And there are tough parts in a PhD for most of us. And I guess my final bit of advice would be to look after yourself. Certainly in my area, a good bit of self-care is required because it's some pretty heavy stuff sometimes. And that can look like exercise and eating well and getting fresh air and, you know, patting a cat and that kind of thing. But it's also asking for help if you need it. And so often when you're a HDR student, you really think that you have to do it all yourself and be the best and do everything right. And that's not the case. So definitely reach out for support if you need it on anything.
Fantastic. Well, what a wonderful and insightful discussion we've had here today. Thank you, Amy, for sharing your time and your knowledge with us for our very first brand new Fearless Minds research series. This is our first one, and we hope to bring you an amazing range of early to mid-career researchers over the next year. Remember, you can watch any of our Fearless Minds episodes on the Flinders YouTube channel or on the Flinders University Fearless Minds webpage. So we hope you can join us for the next one. Thank you and have a great day.